Hi, good evening. My name is Tim Ramsey, and I'm the manager for the George Washington University Club. We really appreciate you coming this evening. We feel we have an exciting program this evening. I'd like to welcome you to the GW Club, which is a faculty, alumni, staff, and friends of the university club, founded in 1999. The clubhouse was originally known as the Lawson Whitney House, circa 1857 to 1858. Typical of the mid-19th century, few of these types of semi-detached homes remain in Washington today, so making the Lawson Whitney House important to the illustration of Washington's early growth. Kathleen Filing Schaus and Uruguay Embassy last inhabited these homes. The club is also a setting for a portion of the university's permanent grant collection. The collection documents the life and times of Ulysses S. Grant, the 18th President of the United States. Donated to the university by Grant's grandson, Grant was a trustee for the university. Grant's dining room table and chairs, as well as upholstered chairs, can be found in the club. In the Grant parlor, on the first floor, is an important oil of Grant by George Peter Alexander Haley, 1877. Several other pieces of art from the university collection hang throughout the club. On behalf of the Board of Governors, we hope you enjoy your evening and welcome you back again soon. It's my pleasure to present to you Ron Goldfarb, Dr. George Carlo, and Marty Schramm's agent. Thank you.
I don't really belong up here. I'm the midwife of this book, but let me say on behalf of my clients a few things that they might be too immodest to say about this sadly important book. I say sad because it is unfortunate that a book like this had to be written, but important because the need was there, and they've done a really splendid job of bringing public information, important information to the public that we all need to know. And there are some very important lessons about both science and public policy that they will talk about. For those of you who, some of you I know have been invited by the bride and some by the groom, I can tell you by way of introduction that George Carlo is that great combination of being both a doctor and a lawyer, a kind of Jewish mother's dream boy. Who's avoided the pitfalls of both profession and applied himself to public health problems in ways that we all have to be very grateful for. Marty Schramm is an old friend of mine and a former newspaper editor, and now one of the, I think, most savvy columnists writing about public affairs. So I was happy to be the midwife of this book. I wish it had been unnecessary. I wish they were both doing something else, but I'm glad the need having been there that they did this book. I remember when George first came to my office to talk about his work, he told me that that this cell phone phenomenon is the biggest selling product in the history of the world. I had an interesting lesson in that this past weekend. I went to the Ericsson to watch some terrific tennis, and at the most intense and quiet moments, all of a sudden you would hear around the stadium, beep, 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 beep. Everybody was listening to nobody had their vibrator on, everybody was listening to their cell phone. It is such a ubiquitous problem that they write about. It seems that whether it's Ralph Nader talking about automobiles or Eugene Wygand talking about tobacco or Carlo and Schramm talking about cell phones, we seem to wish to deny the truths that commerce won't let us face up to. But this important book does face up to it, and it's a great public service that they've done it. So without more, I know this evening is one you all want to get back and see the West Wing. So I'm going to turn it over now to the authors to tell you a little bit about the book, and I know they'll receive any of your questions.
Great. Mainly, I have spent my time in Washington covering presidents, and so writing a book about cell phones is unusual, perhaps. One of the nicest presidents I covered was Jerry Ford, and I'm reminded of his campaign effort in 1976 when he was whistle-stopping through Illinois. And he was on the back of a train stopping at every town. All those towns look alike. And poor Jerry Ford, he kept getting the name of the town wrong because he kept getting mixed up. We left in Joliet and went to Lincoln, Illinois, and he said, it's great to be here in Joliet, Lincoln. And then we went to Springfield, and he said, it's great to be here in Joliet, Lincoln, and Springfield. Well, God loved Jerry Ford. He then tried to recover. He said, ladies and gentlemen, I'm great to be here. So let's have no mistake about it. You're great to be here. C-SPAN is great to be here. Ron, you're great to be here. And George, you have to be here, and so do I. But we're glad to be here. Why did I write a book about cell phones? Because Ron introduced me to George Carlo. And the first thing I did, George, is I really started to try to check you out. Do I really want to write a book about cell phones, and especially co-author a book with anyone? And who is this guy, George Carlo? Well, I found out that he's a scientist, and that he'd been following the science, hired by the cell phone industry to do the study that would prove there were no problems with cell phones. And what I found out anyway was, as long as he found there were no problems, he had no problems with the industry. Then when he began to follow the science and his team found that there were problems, which he'll talk about, at that point he began to have problems. And I found that a lot of my journalistic colleagues found it very easy to pick up derogatory smear information about George Carlo. The industry was playing hardball. That made me want to do the book. And so we've done this book. Cell phones, I think, is unfortunately an important book. And we saw several things. George will talk about the science. It turned out to be the kind of book that I really do report and write and have in the past many times. It's a book about the power game in Washington, about industry lobbyists who had game plans for how to spin the Congress and the federal regulators. And it's a book about federal watchdogs who didn't bark. And there's a lot to tell and a lot to read, and at least we tried to write it like a novel, like a detective story, but it's about science. George?
Thanks, Marty. Well, when I first went to talk to Ron Goldfarb about doing this book, I explained to him the problem that we had done work over a period of 7 years, that we had received $28 million from the cell phone industry, and that we had conducted more than 50 studies, and we found some problems, and that the industry was not happy with the findings, and that I had been in a position where I don't think the full story was able to be told, because everything that I said was being spun in many different ways, and that the public really wasn't in a position to hear the information that they needed to hear. So Ron, being a literary agent, said, well, you need to write a book. And he asked me, he said, well, can you write? And I said, well, sure I can write. I said, I'm a scientist. I have over 100 publications in journals, medical journals, scientific journals. I've written a couple of chapters in books. In fact, I already have a book on cell phones. So he said, well, send it over. So I sent it over, called me the next day, and he said, well, the object is to keep people awake. He said, so we're going to have to get you some help. And that's how I met Marty Schramm. And I have to say that while he was spending 3 weeks checking me out, I was spending 3 weeks checking him out. And it was a very interesting thing that every place I turned and asked the question about Marty Schramm, I got the same answer. Great guy, great writer, great journalist, but very difficult to work with. It's all true. So Marty and I set about in April of last year to begin writing this book. And having never written a book like this before, I thought, well, we can pound this thing out in a couple of months. Not recognizing that it usually takes a couple of years to write a book like this. It turned out that Marty and I worked about 20 hours a day for somewhere around 6 months. And we became alter egos. We ate at each other's house. We argued with each other. Both of us quit at least twice. And in the end, we had, what I think is a very, very important book. The bottom line on this is as follows. Cell phones in the early 1990s took the world by storm. They had never been tested for safety before they were put onto the market. And they were not tested for good reason, because there was no scientific reason to believe that cell phones could cause health problems. And that was because the conventional wisdom with regard to radio frequency radiation was that if you didn't have enough energy to cause heating of biological tissue, like a microwave oven, or if you didn't have enough energy to break DNA, then there was no reason to believe that there could be adverse health effects coming from cellular phones. So that when I took this job in 1993 with the idea that the cell phone industry would put what ultimately became $28 million into this, my view was that it was important to do this work, it was important to do the research, but I never thought we were going to find anything. And at the beginning, I thought that the major problem we were going to have was that we had received all this money from the industry and that people were going to criticize our work for having been nothing more than what the industry wanted and what the industry bought. So because of that, we made sure that we had several layers of independent scientific peer review. We brought in the Harvard School of Public Health to put in place an independent peer review board to look over everything we did. We also asked the federal government to become involved. And the Food and Drug Administration impaneled an interagency working group that included scientists from the National Cancer Institute, from the Food and Drug Administration, from the Environmental Protection Agency, and all of the other federal agencies that had a stake in the whole question of cell phone health effects. The reason we did this was to make sure that all the work would be done above board, to make sure that there would be peer review, so that, and I have to admit this, that I felt that this was the only way that we could protect ourselves from being criticized later, finding no health problems, and not have it be as though the industry simply bought the results. Well, everything was fine until 1995, when we found that the pulsing from digital phones interfered with implanted cardiac pacemakers. And we put together a large clinical study that included the Mayo Clinic, the University of Oklahoma, and Boston University. And we studied more than 1,000 patients. And we found very clearly that the pulsing signal from a digital phone indeed interfered with implanted cardiac pacemakers. Some of that interference was inhibition, meaning it could stop the pacemaker from doing its work. If you're a pacemaker-dependent person, that's a very serious problem. That means you have no heartbeat. So we went public with that finding. We published the finding in the New England Journal of Medicine. We made recommendations to pacemaker wearers, to the public, and to doctors about how to avoid that problem. The solution is a distance. If you keep the phone more than 6 or 7 inches away from the pacemaker, there is not the problem of interference. The industry, however, did not like that. When we put the program in place, we said we were going to be independent. I don't think they believed us. So we independently went out with those recommendations, with the Food and Drug Administration behind us. The industry promptly stopped the funding for the program. And over a period of 9 months, we had no financial support for this very important public health program. As Marty and I detail in the book, during that time, there were a number of discussions, I would say, between me and members of the industry. Many of those discussions were trying to figure out alternatives to the program that we had put in place. Many of those discussions involved things like, George, why don't you come and work with us? We'll take care of you, but you got to be quiet. After 9 months, we finally reached an agreement where the industry was going to put another $13 million into the program, and we were going to go forward finishing the fundamentally important studies of biological effects. Now, a little bit about the science, and I don't want to go on too long, and I want to take some of your questions, but when we began the program in 1993, being a public health guy, it seemed straightforward to me that we needed to identify if there were any health risks. And if there were health risks, we needed to identify ways of mitigating or eliminating those health risks. Pretty straightforward. Find the problem and find the solution. When we began the work in 1993, the first shocker that I had was that there were no tools available to do experiments, to do studies that would allow us to extrapolate or generalize from the laboratory to people. So we had to develop new scientific tools, new laboratory methods, new ways of examining what happens to people who use cellular phones. We had to bring in some of the world's top experts. In the book, we talk about the fellow who invented the stealth technology for the stealth bomber, came and helped us figure out how to expose rats in tubes to the same type of radiation that comes from a cellular phone. So that by the time we finished those tools and began the long-term studies, we were now in 1997, in the beginning of 1998. The first round of studies that came in 1998 did not show any problems. They were studies that looked at whether or not the radio waves could break DNA. And the answer was that there wasn't enough energy from those radio waves to break DNA. So everything looked good up through December of 1998. But at the end of 1998, right around Christmas, I got a series of results in from our laboratory in North Carolina that showed that human blood exposed to radio waves from the cell phone had something in them called micronuclei. Now, micronuclei are little pieces of DNA that have been broken, that do not go back together properly, but they're functioning well enough to form a membrane around them. And when you have micronuclei, that means you have a functioning, defective part of that cell that can clone itself and multiply. And when that happens, you have the development of a tumor. Now, this type of finding is definite genetic damage. The level of radiation exposure that caused that genetic damage was the exact level that we have in people using cell phones. That type of genetic damage is serious. Had that finding occurred prior to phones being put into the market, for example, as part of pre-market testing, which wasn't done for phones, but which is done for pharmaceuticals, for example, pharmaceutical drugs, the phone would never have made it to the market. That finding would be enough to keep a pharmaceutical drug from going into the market. After the Chernobyl explosion in the 1980s, they monitored the people who lived around that nuclear power plant for the presence of micronuclei in their blood. And if they found micronuclei, those people were worked up as the highest risk for developing cancer. So this finding in Christmas of 1998 of micronuclei was very serious. And when I got those results, I sent them back to the lab in North Carolina. I had an interesting discussion with the scientists who had closed down for Christmas. And I said, guys, you're going to have to do this again because this is a very serious, serious finding. So they worked all through Christmas. And they came back in January with another set of results showing the same thing. So now we had 2 sets of laboratory experiments looking at every type of cellular phone technology showing genetic damage. At the same time, we had a series of studies going on looking at people who use cellular phones. And one of those studies was a study of brain cancer among people using cellular phones. Now, one of the things that we found out was that the radiation from the cellular phone antenna penetrates only a couple of inches from the antenna, so that when you put the phone next to your head, the radiation is penetrating a couple of inches into your brain. Now, from a scientific point of view, what that means is that only brain tissue on the outside of the head can possibly be affected by the radiation from the cell phone antenna. And in this study that we had underway in 5 hospitals in northeastern United States, we had included all of the brain cancers, even the brain cancers that were more than 2 inches away from the antenna. And the doctors came back with the finding, with all of the brain cancers, saying there was no increase in the risk of brain cancer associated with cell phone use. But we looked at that and we said, you know what? Let's just see what happens if you only look at the tumors that are on the outside of the head, because we don't see any way that the radiation can penetrate more than a couple of inches. And when they did that, they found that the risk of developing tumors on the outside of the brain was almost 3 times greater in people who use a cell phone compared to people who didn't use a cell phone. It was a statistically significant increase in the risk of neuroepithelial tumors. We had another study that was looking at the risk of acoustic neuroma, which is a benign tumor of the nerve that controls hearing. In people who had reported using a cell phone for 6 years or more, there was a 50% increase in the risk of acoustic neuroma. We then looked back at other studies that had been done, and what we found was that the radiation from a cell phone caused a breakdown in something called the blood-brain barrier. This was the 4th finding. Now, brain tissue is very highly specialized. It does nothing but think. It's not able to ward off infection, fight off any type of environmental insult. It only thinks. That's why we have 2 protections for brain tissue that have evolved. One of them is a thick skull, so it protects the brain from trauma. The other one is something called the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is a filtering system in the blood vessels that are in the head. And what that filtering system does is it keeps the dangerous chemicals that are circulating in your blood from reaching sensitive brain tissue. What we found was that the radiation from the cell phone broke down the blood-brain barrier, opened up the blood-brain barrier. So it made it possible for those dangerous chemicals that are circulating to reach the sensitive brain tissue. So now we're in February of 1999. We have 4 findings that are very, very troubling. They're clear red flags of warning, clear red flags saying something is going on here. Now, in 1993, there were 15 million people using cell phones. In 1999, there were 100 million people using cell phones. So that now we had red flags of danger that could impact 100 million people. So I went to the industry, and I went to their trade meeting, and I met with the board of directors of all of the major companies, and I told them what we found. And I recommended to them that they needed to do more work, but that they needed to let the public know what was known and what was not known. And also to let the public know that there are things that they can do to protect themselves if they're concerned. One of the things is to use a headset, because if the radiation from the antenna is only penetrating a couple of inches, and you keep the antenna away from you, you use a headset like this, well, then the radiation is too far away from you, so you don't have to worry about it. The industry heard my recommendations. They said they were going to properly follow up, but it isn't what they did. They began with a public relations campaign that tried to lead consumers to the conclusion that there were no health risks from cellular phones. They began with advertisements and pamphlets in all the stores around the country, quoting old scientific information about no heating, no breakage of DNA. And it culminated in a series of interviews that I did with the media where one in particular, we had talked a little bit about our findings. They had been made public, and I was, of course, I would talk to whoever in the media wanted to hear about this. And I was doing this interview with a guy from the New York Times. And the New York Times is pretty big. And prior to this, I had done about 50 interviews. And I'm not really shy, and I sort of pick up on what's going on in an interview. And after about 20 minutes, I looked at this guy and I said, what? I said, what's going on? Because he was looking at me like I was crazy. And he told me, he said, I met with CTIA yesterday.
That's the trade association.
That's the trade association. And he said, they said you were nuts. They said you were unstable and that your findings couldn't be believed. Now, at that point, I decided that, I was going to have to take a different tack. And I did agree to do a series of interviews with ABC's 2020 and CBS's 60 Minutes, and decided that the only way that the public was really going to hear about this was for us to talk about it. And in the fall of 1999, 2020 did a full-hour piece on the scientific work that we had done and the findings. Prior to that 2020 show, the industry tried to bring a lawsuit to stop that show from going forward on 2020. 2020's lawyers, they got a lot of lawyers, those guys. They checked it out, and they decided to go forward. They decided to go forward. In the spring of 2000, 2020 did another piece. Public Broadcasting has done a number of reports on this. So the general word was beginning to percolate out. But I still didn't feel that it was being portrayed in a fair and accurate and balanced way, and that's when we decided to do the book. One other thing, and then I'll stop and take your questions. Since we came out with the book in January of this year, there have been 3 epidemiological studies that have been talked about in the general media. Now, one of the epidemiological studies was done by the National Cancer Institute. Another one was done by the University of Essen in Germany, and another one was done by a group of scientists hired by the cell phone industry in Denmark to look at the risk of brain cancer and other cancers associated with cell phone use. The National Cancer Institute study did not find an increase in the risk of tumors, mainly because they did not have the kinds of tumors that occur on the outside of the head in the study. The investigators talked about that in the publication that appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine. They talked about it. They said, you know, if we're concerned about rare tumors on the outside of the head near where the radiation from the antenna comes from, we can't deal with that in this study. We don't have any of those tumors.
They also pointed out that the radiation only goes about 2 inches inside the head, and most of their tumors were not even in that area. So they really did lay it out clearly.
They laid it out clearly. But the New York Times carried a headline saying all clear for cell phones, because the industry had very deftly put together a package, a public relations package, that was so thick that the reporter from the New York Times told me, I got to go with that story because I don't have time to read it. I have a deadline at 5 o'clock. When the Danish study came out, the same kinds of headlines occurred because the industry packaged that up. Now, in between that National Cancer Institute study and the Danish study, the University of Essen in Germany study came out. Now, this study showed somewhere between a tripling and a quadrupling, somewhere between 3 times and 4 times greater risk of developing melanoma of the eye, a cancer of the pigment of the eye, in people who use cell phones compared to people who do not. Highly statistically significant, 300 to 400% increase in the risk. There was no coverage of that finding. There was no coverage of that finding. There were no press releases, so that what's happening is that the public is being misled. Now, all told, there have been 7 epidemiological studies of people who use cell phones. 7 in the world. 5 of the 7 studies show increases in the risk of tumors. We also have findings showing genetic damage. We have findings showing leakage in the blood-brain barrier. Now, one final word of caution. We shouldn't be seeing anything in those human studies. It took us 100 years of people smoking before we saw the first signs of lung cancer risk in smokers. 100 years. For asbestos and mesothelioma of the lung, it took 80 years before we began to see the signs in people. You know why? Because we're the top of the food chain for a reason. Our bodies are tough. We know how to fight environmental insults. We know how to fight disease. Cell phones have been in widespread use for less than a decade. Not even a whole generation. So we shouldn't be seeing anything. We also have a circumstance where children are being marketed to with Disney characters on phones, where they have family plans, where you can buy one cost, at one cost you can have 4 phones on the same number and not have to pay for all of that. They're marketing the children. Nobody knows the impact of somebody using a cell phone when they're 9, 10, 12 years old, using it for the rest of their life.
But there is one thing, by the way, that we do know from studies that are in our book and even photographs. You see the damage, the penetration of a cell phone in an adult head, and it's about this much. And in a teenager's head, about this much. And for a 6-year-old, it goes almost from one end of the head to the other because the skull isn't formed. So that Disney phone decal idea was really a bad idea. And George, the only good news of the cell phone industry, they never said anything about it, but they pulled those Disney characters off the market.
That's right. Now, we didn't rehearse this, but what he's talking about is actually in the book.
Yeah.
This is the cross-section of a head, of a skull, okay? This is the radiation penetration in an adult. That little thing there is the ear. This is the penetration into the brain in an adult. This is the penetration in a 10-year-old child. This is the penetration in a 5-year-old child. Now, already in England and in France, There have been government steps taken to warn against children using cell phones. In the United States, nothing has been done. In the United States right now, the cell phone industry is unregulated with regard to health and safety. It is an unregulated industry. So consumers are really on their own in terms of safety.
As we go to questions, we should also add that there's nothing that we've said that the federal regulators don't know. The FDA has all of this information. They've run days of seminars studying the documentation and the studies that George Carlo and his team did. They know all about this. At the very least, they could be going on television and telling you what they know, at the very least.
Questions?
At what point in the use of the phone is the radiation, and that's the problem, right? The radiation.
Radiation from the phone?
Is it most severe?
Here's what happens. When the phone call is first made, during dialing and ringing, there are a whole bunch of connections that have to be made between the antenna and the base station that carries the signal. So the maximum amount of power, the maximum amount of radiation coming from that power occurs during dialing and ringing at the beginning of the phone call. As the phone call goes on, the amount of power drops off, as does the amount of radiation. However, the most important determinant of how much radiation comes from that antenna is not how long you're on the phone, but it's where you are when you make that phone call with relationship to the base station. The further away the base station is, the harder that phone has to work. It has to put out more power, therefore the radiation amount is higher. That's why sometimes when you look at your phone, it has the 4 bars in the left-hand side of the display. When it has 4 bars showing, that means the phone is pretty well cruising. It's not working too hard. But when you have 2 bars or 1 bar, the phone is working very, very hard, which means it's the maximum amount of radiation coming from that phone. Now, with that being the case, we don't know whether one 10-minute phone call is better or worse than 10 one-minute phone calls. We can't say at this point. That's why the only recommendation that we make in the book is for people to keep the antenna away from their body. It's the only science-based recommendation that can be made at this point.
How about the two of you? Do you use a telephone, cell telephone? Do you use a cell telephone?
I use it, and I use it with a headset. So does George.
So do I.
Well, one other thing that people need to know is a lot of times people say, oh, I don't need to pull the antenna out. I can hear it just fine like this. Wrong. As George told me, one of our first meetings, the radiation comes not out of the tip of it, but out of the middle, right there, 2 inches around. So if you've got it down here like this, uh-oh, the whole phone is become an antenna, and you're really at much greater risk. Put it out, you're better off. If you have one of those cell phone where the antenna goes off to the side, you're still better off. If you're wearing a headset, using a headset, you're ahead of the game.
Yes?
I just saw that you pulled the phone out from your pocket by your chest. Would that affect your heart or your chest or anything? I mean, I would assume there wouldn't be protection there. Would you be better off putting it someplace
Putting
else?
it by the liver? Yeah. There's no good way, but actually, as a courtesy to George, I turned my cell phone off, so it's not on. But truth be told, when it is on, it's also there, or sometimes I wear it at my waist. Neither way is good, but as soon as it rings, I try to take it off immediately and hold it away. There's no good way to have your cell phone on your body and keep it detached from you unless you're going to carry it at the end of a stick, and that's rather inconvenient.
More layers of clothing though, so if you had it in your coat pocket by your liver.
Ask the science guy.
Yeah.
Would that make any difference or not?
Not really. I mean, here's the thing. The first is that by carrying the phone in your breast pocket, for example, if you have a pacemaker, and the phone's on, that's a bad thing. Because when the phone rings, during dialing and ringing, what do we have? The maximum amount of radiation. And most of the time, pacemakers are implanted in the clavicular region anyway. They're right here. So that's not, if you have a pacemaker, that's not a good thing to do. If you don't have a pacemaker, the radiation doesn't really care whether it's brain tissue, liver tissue, heart muscle, or whatever. It penetrates 2 to 3 inches away from the antenna when the phone is in dialing and ringing. Now, when the phone is on and you're just carrying it around, there's really no radiation. It only happens when there is a connection between the phone and a base station. But the interesting thing about that is that there are a number of companies now that are developing shields that would be able to be used, on your waist, around the phone, so that the radiation arguably would not penetrate. Now, the bad news, and we point this out in the book, is that the Food and Drug Administration here in the United States and other regulatory agencies around the world have not demanded that these companies that have these products that are supposed to be mitigating the effects of radiation be tested to make sure that they can meet their label claims. Now, why? Because the Food and Drug Administration has not been able to admit here in the United States that there's a problem with cell phones.
Let me tell you the extent to which they have not been able to admit it. In August of last year, they ran a 2-day seminar of the top scientists from all over the world came to study the findings of George Carlo's team and others, the micronuclei findings, if you will. And then 2 weeks later, the head of the agency that ran that seminar went on the Larry King Show, a whole hour on CNN devoted to the cell phone issue. And he was asked, do you see any problems? He said, we see no health effects, period. If you take a look at his quote and put it up against the quote that Motorola was putting out and had been putting out for years, you'll see they're identical. I have a real problem with that. I think they should at least tell us what they know, what is in their files, what's in the National Cancer Institute files, where this is why George says I'm hard to work with, because I said, George, when you talk about micronuclei, it's not enough. Go tell me what I can tell people that'll mean something. And we found a bunch of reports in the National Cancer Institute files that say that cancer experts say that micronuclei is, quote, a diagnostic marker for high risk for cancer. And that's a real concern.
Yes?
Marty, as a student of the media, do you think the media has ignored this book, and if so, why?
I think the media has not ignored this book, but they've certainly slighted it. And part of the reason is because of the studies that have come out, the epidemiological studies that George talked about. And this is very interesting. This is the real failure of my profession. These are reporters who look at the studies and they say, no problem. And that's what the headlines say, and so on. What they don't realize is that these were studies by statistical people and not laboratory scientists. They studied tumors that could not possibly be reached by a cell phone and then concluded that the cell phone didn't cause that problem. And that does not seem to be a very strong assurance to me. I'm not very reassured by that. Yet we face a new danger now, and that danger is a danger of flawed studies that lead to false assurances and lead people to not take the steps that we can all take to protect ourselves. Wear a headset. That's a real concern.
Yes?
Other than the brain tumors and the pacemaker conditions, what other have there been any other studies on the results of the medical conditions as a result, say, of wearing it on your hip, and other than the eye?
The eye finding is very, very serious. This melanoma of the eye is a very serious condition because melanoma can be very fatal. And if you have that tumor in the coloring of your eye, it can very easily metastasize, become systemic. So that is not something that's trivial. That eye cancer finding is one that is very, very serious as far as I'm concerned. There are,
Trivialize it. I'm trying to get to another point. You're talking about the concerns, and we're all here to hear about those. And we're also interested in finding out ways to protect ourselves. And wearing these things on our hips, which most of us probably do. Have there been any studies, say, with respect to liver or any other physiological concerns with this? And what, since you're a scientist and I'm not, what compounds or metals could be used to block the radiation as it is from these antennas and these phones from your body?
all of those points are very important points. The answer is that no one is looking. We don't know about impacts on the liver because no one is studying it. Currently, all of the funding in the United States that had been allocated to the study of cell phones has stopped. The industry and the FDA have something called a CRADA, a Cooperative Research and Development Agreement, where they're going to begin doing some more research. And we point this out in the book, where the kinds of things that you point out are the things that should be done. Impacts on children, impacts on the liver. How about pregnant women? You know, we had an instance where we have this little registry where people who have health problems are able to call and register confidentially the information so that we can track, see what happens to people who use cell phones. And this is a true instance. A woman was pregnant, and she had gained a whole lot of weight during her pregnancy. She had a hard time getting up and walking, so her husband bought her a cell phone. And what she was able to do was take the cell phone and lay it on her stomach so that when, instead of having to walk across the room to answer the phone, she was able to pick up the phone and talk. So we have this in our registry. She has a baby. The baby dies, and it's a Down syndrome baby. Now, we have no idea whether the cell phone had anything to do with that. But it's in our registry. And you know what? There's no one looking to see whether or not that kind of thing is happening. The only research that they're doing in this CRADA is to recheck our blood studies to see whether or not they can come up with a finding that shows no micronuclei, and to recheck the epidemiological studies that we did on the neural epithelial tumors.
In Britain and in France, the governments are funding studies. In the United States, the industry funds the studies, and the government passes the assignments along to scientists, but the industry controls the product.
So the short answer is that the work that should be done is not being done. The only work that's being funded in the United States is work that's being done to try to reverse the findings of problems.
What about the compounds? I mean, I'm no scientist, and you know, you've already stated that clothing won't block this form of radiation or this form of radiation. What will?
Well, interesting you mentioned clothing, because Barney's in New York, this store, they had a radiation shield overcoat for sale for $900. Supposed to block the radiation. Damn thing weighed 100 pounds. You know, it was lead and everything. So we don't know exactly what to, where this is going to move.
At least it wasn't asbestos.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I read an article in the press that when you use the headphone in the cell phone, there's a concern the radiation from the cell phone can go up the wire to the headphone and still come up next to your head. Can you comment on that?
Yes, well, there was a study that was funded by a magazine in England about 6-8 months ago.
Called Which, with a question mark.
Which magazine. And they had gone into a laboratory and use something sort of like a Geiger counter to measure some kind of what radiation might be coming from the wires in headsets. And based on that, they came out with a news story saying that the headsets actually magnified the radiation.
Did they show you the documentation?
There was no documentation that was available, and then when they went back and redid it after they came under tremendous amounts of criticism by scientific groups around the world, they tempered their findings and said that there are some headsets that may pick up some radiation. So the bottom line on that is that there's no reason scientifically right now to believe that the headsets magnify the radiation or are a problem. The difficulty is that the news media picked that story up, and with the internet now, it was all over the world. Every place I talk, I get that question all the time. And the bottom line was that it is not scientifically supportable. Yes?
I know your book just came out, but what reaction have you gotten from U.S. government officials, either privately or publicly, in response to your book?
Let me talk about that just a little bit, because if you'll notice, there is one thing missing in our book that should be there, and that is a comment from the Food and Drug Administration, since they're the prime agency that's supposed to be regulating this. I'd asked them for interviews, and they found out that I was doing a book as a co-author with George Carlo, and somehow decided that they wouldn't give us interviews. What they wanted instead, they said, was if I will give them a list of questions that I want to ask, they will decide whether or not they'll have an interview. I explained to the spokesperson for the FDA that in 30 years in this town and traveling throughout the world, I've only come across that one time, really, and it wasn't really here in the United States. It was in the Soviet Union during the Cold War. When I asked to interview someone, I was told, well, they wanted to know what I wanted to ask, and then they'd decide if they wanted to give me an interview. I said, I don't do that. It's a game, and I'm not going to play that game. I interview every official, from presidents all the way on down to the people who really know something. And in all cases, I've found that people are very willing to just sit and answer your questions unless they have a reason for not. They just wanted to know what was in our book, and now they do.
And have you gotten any interesting private reactions, even from government officials, since it's come out?
Yes, there are senators and representatives who are especially interested. I don't have any private reactions from the regulators yet. My guess is that on Capitol Hill, they will understand what the bottom line is, and they will do the right thing. The General Accounting Office is doing a study, is just finishing one, and it will be very interesting to see if they recommend that the government agencies get involved or continue to take no action.
I want to follow up 2 points on that. The first is that the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, is in a real jam right now. And the reason is this, is that when cell phones were first put into the market in the 1980s, they gave them a pass in terms of pre-market testing, did not require any pre-market testing. When the questions about brain cancer were first raised in 1993, and there were 15 million people using cell phones, the FDA and the industry sort of made a deal. They said, look, we're probably not going to find out anything anyway. Industry, you put in some money to do research. FDA, we will not regulate until we have data. That was 15 million people. Well, now we have 110 million people today. The FDA is in a jam, because if they step forward and say there are health risks from cell phones, the next question is, well, how did you let 110 million people slip through the cracks? So that the FDA is absolutely crippled. Now, the other reaction to the book that I think is probably more telling than what comes from the government is this, is that, you know, I use a headset, and I'm on the phone all the time. You know, to the credit of Verizon, they haven't canceled my service or anything. I'm still able to pay them my $1,000 a month, and they let me use the phone. But I go through these headsets like water. I need a new headset about every couple of months. So where I live over in Alexandria in the Potomac Yards, there's an AT&T store. So I go in there all the time. Now, of course, the first time I went into that store after 2020, because I would imagine what happened is that everybody who worked in that industry had to look at that tape. So I went walking in there, and you would have thought that, well, they recognized me. And I had sort of a chilly reception. The next time I went in, you know, I had sort of a different kind of reception. And after the book came out, I went in and I needed a headset, and of course, I know right where they are. And so then what happens is this guy comes over and he says, "Hey, man," he says, "you're the guy, huh?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You're Carlo. You're the one who wrote the book." And I said, "Yeah." He said, "I've been reading the book." He said, "I haven't been able to buy it." He said, "But I go into Barnes & Noble and I read it." He doesn't really want to own it. Then he hands me, I bought my thing, and I had my little receipt, and he says, "You signed this for my wife?" So I have a feeling that things are chilling in the industry on this a little bit too. Because, look, all we're saying here is that there are red flags of warning. We don't know what they mean long term. But as a consumer, you should have the right to make your own choice about how much risk you want to assume. And it really should be up to the government and the industry to give you the information you need to make an informed choice about risk. That's all we're saying. Yes?
Without using the headset, is the one phone dangerous than the other? Like, I got this flip up, and I feel like I have the shield that you keep saying, hoping my dog's better than the other ones. Is it any...
Well, as it turns out, that particular phone, which is a StarTAC, which has the antenna going out, actually changes. Now, that plastic shield does not do anything. That does not do anything. The radiation goes right through that. But the antenna that juts out a little bit away from the head changes the pattern, changes where the radiation hit. Doesn't eliminate it. It just changes where it hits the head.
And the antenna is 2 inches further away from your head than it might have been otherwise.
Yes. Then I'll come over here.
Obviously, money talks on the Hill. So are you all planning on having a coalition of people lobbying for your interests?
George is going to pay for a whole bunch of lobbyists to go up there and do that. It's a good idea, George. Why don't you just shell out? Yeah. George will do that.
To, help some money be pitched that way, as opposed to being pitched only in the cell phone industry.
Well, the interesting thing is this: is that when we came out with our findings in March of 1999, and coincident with that, all the money stopped. There still are bills that the industry has not paid that are over 1.5 years old now. And I had the team of scientists, some of them are here, people who worked with us. And I said, we have to go on, we have to keep going on, but we just don't have funding. And you know, and you know what? But they, good thinking. But
always thinking.
And actually, a follow-up on that. I mean, if you're going through headsets so quickly, is it the radiation burning them out?
No, it's not the radiation burning them out. It's actually just because they're not made very durably. But the point was that people wanted to keep working, and we had a thing up in our office because we had found out that the cell phone industry had put out an RFP looking to hire public relations firms to, quote, inoculate the media against us. And the rumor was that the RFP, the request for proposals, was for somewhere between $5 million and $10 million. So, you know what we did? We took a $5 bill and we put it in a frame. And we put a thing on it right in the office that says they have $5 million, we have 5, but we're going to win.
We're not sure who won. We have time for one more short, quick question. George, you can pick it. Pick an easy one.
Let's have 3. Okay. Okay.
Do cordless phones have the same effect?
Cordless phones are different. That's
cordless phones in your house, the kind that hang on the kitchen wall.
The thing that causes the radiation is the amount of power that pushes the radio wave signal. That's where the radiation comes from. Now, in a cellular phone, we have to take this signal from here several miles sometimes to a base station. That takes a big push of power to run that signal in that direction. But the cordless phone in your house maybe has to go between here and the bedroom, which might be 25, 30, 40 feet. So the distance makes it unnecessary for large amounts of power to push the signal. And because there's not a lot of power, there's not a lot of radiation. So cordless phones are not a problem. Yes?
What level of use are we talking about where you start seeing the risks? I think we remember some of the studies that have been done, like on saccharin, where you'd have to eat 10 pounds of saccharin before you start seeing the risk that developed in some of the studies. Are you talking about 2 hours a day, 10 hours a day? Any level?
When we developed those tools that were non-existent, we made sure that we were able to get away from that problem of maximum exposures and all of that. So we developed tools that measured what really happens with a cell phone. In fact, as we talk about it in the book, one of the experimental systems actually had a tape playing for the rats while they were being exposed. So they could be listening just the same way you'd be listening, because the noise, the voice dissonance changes the signal. We found problems at the same level of radiation that you're exposed to every day. That's what's most alarming. We're not talking about like we were with saccharin, where you have to drink 40 cases of Coke a day for 80 years before you see anything. We're talking about the same signals that you receive every day when you use the phone. Yes?
I think maybe the follow-up to her is I probably spend 10 minutes a day on the phone. There are people that spend 4 hours plus a day on the phone. Were you looking for, and did you find some correlation in the amount of tumors you found with the heavy users?
The difficulty is that, as I pointed out earlier to this gentleman, the amount of radiation depends more on where you are when you make the phone call than how long you're on the phone. So we would have to figure out a way to chart you and chart everyone else who uses the phone when they're making the calls. So there's no way for us to say what amount of use in terms of minutes or hours matters. Now, we can say that if you've owned a phone for 5 years or owned a phone for 10 years, you have relatively more chance for exposure. But that's about all we can do, very imprecise.
Understand this, those studies that we've talked about that have been in the papers in the past few weeks, when you take a look in the fine print and find out how long those people used the phone, you see on the average they used it for 2.5, 2.5 hours a month. Now, most of us who have phones get bills for 1,000 hours, 1,000 minutes, 1,500 minutes, something like that. So another flaw in the studies so far is these people used phones in the early and mid-1990s for not very much at all.
Yes?
Could there be a safe phone made?
I think that there can be a safe phone made. This is the most sophisticated technology that we've ever really had. And this industry is technologically so advanced and so proficient that there's no reason why a safe phone can't be made. There are already, for example, microchips that have been developed that cause some type of perturbation in the signal that may eliminate biological effects. Haven't really been tested yet, but those are the kinds of things I think we can do. So there's no reason why there can't be a safe phone. The difficulty is that right now, consumers are not being given the opportunity to protect themselves. That's the problem.
Why don't we end it there, and we'll be downstairs where the food, the drink, and the books are.
Would like to officially thank George and Marty for coming this evening, taking time out of their busy schedules to be with us. In the grand parlor downstairs, we do have books for sale from the GW bookstore. They'll be on hand to sign the books if you care to, and we have cocktails and hors d'oeuvres.
Great to be here in Joliet, Lincoln, and Springfield. Well, God loved Jerry Ford. He then tried to recover. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm great to be here." So let's have no mistake about it. You're great to be here. C-SPAN is great to be here. Ron, you're great to be here. And George, you have to be here, and so do I. But we're glad to be here. Why did I write a book about cell phones? Because Ron introduced me to George Carlo. And the first thing I did, George, is I really started to try to check you out. Do I really want to write a book about cell phones, and especially co-author a book with anyone? And who is this guy, George Carlo? Well, I found out that he's a scientist, and that he'd been following the science, hired by the cell phone industry to do the study that would prove there were no problems with cell phones. And what I found out anyway was, as long as he found there were no problems, he had no problems with the industry. Then when he began to follow the science and his team found that there were problems, which he'll talk about, at that point he began to have problems. And I found that a lot of my journalistic colleagues found it very easy to...
Hi, good evening. My name is Tim Ramsey, and I'm the manager for the George Washington University Club. We really appreciate you coming this evening. We feel we have an exciting program this evening. I'd like to welcome you to the GW Club, which is a faculty, alumni, staff, and Friends of the University Club, founded in 1999. The clubhouse was originally known as the Lawson Whitney House, circa 1857 to 1858. Typical of the mid-19th century, few of these types of semi-detached homes remain in Washington today, so making the Lawson Whitney House important to the illustration of Washington's early growth. Catherine Filing Schaus and Uruguay Embassy last inhabited these homes. The club is also a setting for a portion of the university's permanent grant collection. The collection documents the life and times of Ulysses S. Grant, the 18th President of the United States. Donated to the university by Grant's grandson, Grant was a trustee for the university. Grant's dining room table and chairs, as well as upholstered chairs, can be found in the club. In the Grant parlor, on the first floor, is an important oil of Grant by George Peter Alexander Haley, 1877. Several other pieces of art from the university collection hang throughout the club. On behalf of the Board of Governors, we hope you enjoy your evening and welcome you back again soon. It's my pleasure to present to you Ron Goldfarb, Dr. George Carlo, and Marty Schramm's agent. Thank you.
I don't really belong up here. I'm the midwife of this book, but let me say on behalf of my clients a few things that they might be too immodest to say about this sadly important book. I say sad because it is unfortunate that a book like this had to be written, but important because the need was there, and they've done a really splendid job of bringing public information, important information to the public that we all need to know. And there are some very important lessons about both science and public policy that they will talk about. For those of you who, some of you I know have been invited by the bride and some by the groom, I can tell you by way of introduction that George Carlo is that great combination of being both a doctor and a lawyer, a kind of Jewish mother's dream boy. Talking about tobacco, or Carlo and Schramm talking about cell phones. We seem to wish to deny the truths that commerce won't let us face up to. But this important book does face up to it, and it's a great public service that they've done it. So without more, I know this evening is one you all want to get back and see the West Wing. So I'm going to turn it over now to the authors to tell you a little bit about the book, and I know they'll receive any of your questions.
Great. Mainly, I have spent my time in Washington covering presidents, and so writing a book about cell phones is unusual, perhaps. One of the nicest presidents I covered was Jerry Ford, and I'm reminded of his campaign effort in 1976 when he was whistle-stopping through Illinois. And he was on the back of a train, stopping at every town. All those towns look alike. And poor Jerry Ford, he kept getting the name of the town wrong because he kept getting mixed up. We left in Joliet and went to Lincoln, Illinois, and he said, "It's great to be here in Joliet, Lincoln." And then we went to Springfield, and he said, it's
Who's avoided the pitfalls of both profession and applied himself to public health problems in ways that we all have to be very grateful for. Marty Schramm is an old friend of mine and a former newspaper editor, and now one of the, I think, most savvy columnists writing about public affairs. So I was happy to be the midwife of this book. I wish it had been unnecessary. I wish they were both doing something else, but I'm glad the need, having been there, that they did this book. I remember when George first came to my office to talk about his work, he told me that that this cell phone phenomenon is the biggest selling product in the history of the world. I had an interesting lesson in that this past weekend. I went to the Ericsson to watch some terrific tennis, and at the most intense and quiet moments, all of a sudden you would hear around the stadium, beep, 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 beep. Everybody was listening to nobody had their vibrator on, everybody was listening to their cell phone. It is such a ubiquitous problem that they write about. It seems that whether it's Ralph Nader talking about automobiles or Eugene Wygant